You know, when we look back, it seems like our entire life has been a story we didn't realize we were writing. Everything seemed so clear, so simple, until the day the wind turned and the sky darkened. I never imagined that the greatest blow of my life would come from the very people I loved and trusted the most. I was deceived, humiliated, and yet I found a strength inside me that I didn't even know I had. Are you curious to find out how it all happened? Then subscribe to the channel now and leave a comment telling me where you're listening to this story from. I love to know where you're following me from. And look, if I were you, I wouldn't miss what's coming up. The truth I'm about to reveal will move you in ways you can't even imagine. Are you ready? My name is Donna Margarita, and my story, which seemed like any other, took a turn that no one could have predicted. It was meant to be a peaceful life, full of family, love, and joy. The kind of life where children grow up, get married, and we watch it all with pride and happiness. I had the privilege of watching my son marry a wonderful woman, a daughter-in-law I considered my own. She came into my home with such a sincere smile, with such good energy, that I could never imagine that this woman, who seemed to embody sweetness, could hide such deep pain and such a big lie. The love between my husband and I was simple but strong. He was always a quiet man, one of few words, but who showed his affection through his actions. He worked hard in the fields, and I, with my calloused hands, helped take care of the house, the children, our home. Life was never luxurious, but it was always full of smiles and tranquility. Over time, I watched my son grow up, and with a mother's pride, I saw his marriage flourish. I knew my daughter-in-law loved my son, and I knew my son loved her deeply. I never imagined that, in the middle of all that apparent happiness, the greatest nightmare of my life would unfold. The changes began subtly, almost imperceptibly. I saw my husband growing more distant, quieter, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't understand what was happening. I, who had always been observant, began to notice that something wasn't right. My son seemed so happy, so secure, so full of dreams with his wife by his side. And it was in that picture of apparent happiness that the biggest nightmare of my life took shape. The first clue I had, if I can call it that, was in my husband's gaze. He was more tired, more distracted, always with his mind somewhere else. He came home late one night, and instead of resting next to me, he went straight to his room. I stayed there, in the living room, wondering if he was okay, but said nothing. After all, he was always like that, reserved, and I had learned to respect his space. Life continued, as always, but my intuition, that faithful companion, wouldn't leave me in peace. Something was out of place. Days went by, and I noticed more small changes. My daughter-in-law, once so affectionate, became colder with me. She still smiled, but her eyes, once bright, now seemed clouded, as if she was carrying a heavy secret. I asked myself what could be happening. I felt that she was hiding something from me, something that didn't make sense, but I didn't want to believe the worst. After all, how could the woman I considered my daughter do something that would hurt both my son and me? The pain of realizing this was unbearable. But destiny has its own way of showing us the truth, even when we try to hide from it, and that's exactly what happened to me. One day, my husband left for work earlier than usual, and I stayed home, tidying up some things. I don't know why, but something told me to go to their room. I entered quietly, as if I were looking for something, and it was there, at that moment, that I found what I never imagined seeing. My husband and my daughter-in-law were there, together, lying on the bed, and the world collapsed beneath me. The sight of their naked bodies shocked me, but it wasn't just that. It was the betrayal, the lie, the pain of knowing that my own daughter-in-law was stealing from me the last thing I thought was mine, the trust in my family. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think straight. The only thing I managed to do was to leave that room, run away from there, without knowing whether I should cry, shout, or simply walk away. All I knew was that my life, which I thought was so secure, had crumbled in those seconds. My son, whom I loved so much, was being deceived. I, who always thought I had done everything right, was living a lie. At that moment, I realized that the truth hurts more than any physical pain. It tears you apart inside, leaving you without a ground to stand on, without direction. But, at the same time, it forces you to see things as they really are. It was hard to accept, so very hard, But that betrayal gave me something I never expected: strength. I realized that despite everything, I would not be defeated by a lie. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know exactly what. What I did know is that, no matter how difficult it was, the truth had reached me, and now I would have to deal with it. I always thought love was simple, the kind of love that is built day by day, in the small things. Life with my husband, my son, and my daughter-in-law seemed to be the picture of peace. Like every mother, I was proud to see my son grow, get married, and start a family. Everything seemed so right, so perfect. But I should have noticed earlier that life sometimes gives us warning signs, and that things are never as simple as they seem. It all started with small changes, almost imperceptible, but over time, they began to bother me. I, who had always been observant, began to notice that my husband, Joachim, was growing more distant. He had always been a man of few words, but now, besides his silence, there was a certain coldness in his gestures. I used to say that he was quiet, but affectionate, and that was enough. However, I started noticing that his routine was changing. He was coming home later from work, returning home tired, but not in the usual way. He seemed more preoccupied, more absorbed, as if his mind was somewhere else. At first I tried to understand. Farm life is hard, the work is heavy, and Joachim has always been a man with responsibilities. Maybe it was accumulated fatigue or the pressure of everyday life. But at the same time, I started noticing that he didn't look at me the same way. That look, which had always brought me comfort and security, seemed to have vanished. He would avoid my gaze, turning away as if it were a painful thing to look me in the eyes. And this made me feel a quiet pain, but a very real one. In addition to that, my daughter-in-law, Estella, began to act differently with me. At first, I thought it was just the adjustment of a young woman marrying into her in-laws' home. But little by little, something told me it wasn't just that. She began to be more reserved, more closed off. Before, she used to come to me, ask for advice, share laughter during the afternoons. But now, she would hide in her corner, always with a forced smile, but her eyes were distant, as though they carried a heavy burden. I wondered what could be happening. I felt she was hiding something from me, something that didn't make sense, but I didn't want to believe the worst. After all, how could the woman I considered my daughter do something that would hurt both my son and me? The pain of realizing this was unbearable. But life has its way of showing us the truth, even when we try to hide from it, and that's exactly what happened to me. One day, my husband left for work earlier than usual, and I stayed home, tidying up a few things. I don't know why, but something told me to go to their room. I entered quietly, as if I were looking for something, and it was there, at that moment, that I found what I never imagined seeing. My husband and my daughter-in-law were there, together, lying in bed, and the world collapsed beneath me. It wasn't just their naked bodies that shocked me, but the betrayal, the lie, the pain of knowing that my own daughter-in-law was stealing from me the last thing I thought was mine, the trust in my family. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think straight. The only thing I could manage to do was leave that room, run away from there, not knowing whether I should cry, shout, or simply walk away. All I knew was that my life, which I thought was so secure, had crumbled in those seconds. My son, whom I loved so much, was being deceived. I, who always thought I had done everything right, was living a lie. At that moment, I realized that the truth hurts more than any physical pain. It tears you apart inside, leaving you without a ground to stand on, without direction. But at the same time, it forces you to see things as they really are. It was hard to accept, so very hard. But that betrayal gave me something I never expected: strength. I realized that, despite everything, I would not be defeated by a lie. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know exactly what. What I did know is that, no matter how difficult it was, the truth had reached me, and now I would have to deal with it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. The room was dark, but the moonlight softly illuminated the walls. My body was there, in bed, but my mind couldn't rest. I couldn't stop going back to that image, to the moment when the truth was revealed to me, like a punch to the stomach. I wanted to believe it was all just a nightmare, but the reality was cruel, and I knew I could no longer ignore it. For weeks, I tried to find explanations. I tried to convince myself that I was wrong, that my mind was creating scenarios where there were none. I believe it was fear that made me seek justifications. Fear of losing my family, fear of losing everything we had built together, fear of seeing my son, the man I raised, going through the pain of learning the truth. I spent my days trying to act as if nothing had changed. I smiled at my son and daughter-in-law, made lunch, took care of the house as if the world were still the same. But inside me, everything was shattered. I felt like a woman living on the surface of her own life, unable to dive into the depths of what was really happening. But my heart knew. It knew what my mind was stubbornly refusing to accept. Doubt had already settled in me, and it was a shadow that wouldn't leave, no matter how much I tried to pretend nothing had happened. Then, the day came when, once again, life forced me to face the truth. It was on a hot summer afternoon. I was sitting on the porch, sewing a piece of fabric, when I saw Joaquim and Estela approaching. They were talking, but their voices weren't the same as before. The way they looked at each other, how they seemed to disguise what was going on, all of that made me clearly see what I had been trying to ignore. I tried to push away the thoughts that emerged, but I couldn't. My chest tightened with every word they exchanged. The way they looked at each other was different, and I knew that something had changed between them. It wasn't just the simple affection between a father-in-law and daughter-in-law anymore. It was something deeper, something I could no longer ignore. It was when Estela unknowingly smiled at him that I understood. It wasn't just any smile, but one full of complicity, as if she had become part of something that I had no idea about. I felt like a stranger in my own house. The feeling of being excluded, of not being part of that, made my throat tighten. At that moment, everything clicked. The small changes, the exchanged glances, my husband's distance, Estela's behavior, everything became as clear as day. I was being betrayed, not only by my husband, but also by the woman I had welcomed as part of my family. The man I loved was involved with the person I considered my daughter. I didn't know what to do. The pain was so intense that it felt like the ground had disappeared from beneath my feet. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to them and confront them, but I couldn't move. I just stayed there, frozen, watching. Shame consumed me, and at the same time, a growing anger mixed with the pain. The shame of being deceived, of being made a fool of not seeing what was right in front of my eyes. Hours passed, and once again, I found myself alone, not knowing what to do with the truth that was now out in the open. There were no more doubts, no more room for explanations. The certainty of the betrayal suffocated me, and I knew that, in that moment, my life would never be the same. Everything I had built, all the dreams and the trust I had in the people I loved most, was falling apart. I sat there, on the porch, watching the sun set, wondering what to do next. What would I do with the pain that now filled me? What would I do with the truth that tore me apart inside? I didn't know yet, but one thing was clear. I could no longer live in the lie. I needed to face what was happening, no matter how difficult it would be. When the day came to an end, and the house was silent, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep ignoring the obvious. What would happen next was beyond my control, but the only thing I could control was how I would react. And although I knew the pain would be great, I also knew that the truth had its own power. The truth, though painful, was my ally, and somehow it would give me the strength to move forward. I always believed that the worst thing in life was betrayal, but I never imagined that one day it would come so cruelly and accompanied by the deepest pain I could feel. The worst part wasn't even the lie itself, but the fact that it came from those I loved most, from the man I had chosen to share my life with, and from the woman I welcomed into my home as a daughter. The blow didn't come from the outside, it came from within, and that is what destroyed me the most. When the truth settled in me, the first feeling was of such a deep emptiness that it felt as if my soul were collapsing. The pain was immediate, but at the same time, a sense of distrust in everything I had believed until then washed over me. How could I not see it? How could I have been so blind? These questions relentlessly hammered in my mind, while shame consumed me. I knew things would never be the same, but what I didn't know was how much I would have to fight to get back up. The pain of realizing that my husband, the man I had spent my whole life with, was involved with my daughter-in-law, the woman I considered my daughter, was something that made me want to disappear. It wasn't just Joaquim's betrayal that hurt me, but the fact that she, Estela, was also complicit. She, who called me mother, who hugged me, who shared the most precious moments of our family, was breaking the trust I had placed in her so easily. My heart ached just thinking about it. It was a pain from many angles. I felt like I had been betrayed, not just as a woman, but also as a mother and mother-in-law. I felt that the woman I once was, the one who trusted, no longer existed. And with each step I took, with each look I exchanged with my son, with my daughter-in-law, there was a part of me that no longer believed in anything. I saw myself lost in a maze of lies and deceit, and the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. I tried to understand the reasons. My mind wanted to find an explanation, a justification that would make everything seem less cruel, less dirty. But the more I tried, the more the truth crushed me. There was no explanation. There was no reason that could justify the betrayal in such an insane way. Love was not the reason there. It was merely a game of vanity and interests, an unfaithful passion that destroyed everything I had worked for my entire life. I felt invalid, powerless to understand something that seemed impossible to understand. In the days that followed, my son seemed like a hollow man. He wanted to believe that the child Estella was carrying was his, and the pain of seeing his innocence gradually fade away ripped pieces from my heart. I saw the sadness in his eyes, but I could do nothing. The truth that I knew, that he didn't, made me feel even more helpless. He trusted her so much. He was so happy. How could I destroy all of that? How could I throw in his face that the child he was so lovingly waiting for wasn't his? I didn't have the courage. At the same time, I asked myself, how could she do this? How could Estella, who always treated me with such affection, be so disloyal? She knew I trusted her. She knew I saw her as part of my family. I didn't want to believe that she had betrayed me like this. I couldn't process what was happening. How could someone deceive so coldly the person who had welcomed her? These thoughts gnawed at me from the inside, and I saw myself, day after day, increasingly tired of carrying that truth alone. But at the same time, I felt that I needed to keep everything a secret. I couldn't share this pain with anyone. I couldn't tell the truth because it would destroy everything. And if I revealed what I knew, I would lose my son. I would lose everything I had left. The fear of losing my family consumed me, and it was that which kept me silent, suffering in solitude. But when I looked at Estella's face, when I saw her fake smile, the rehearsed words, the weight of the lie she carried, I knew that sooner or later, the truth would have to be told. I couldn't live with this lie, not anymore. And the worst part was knowing that, by telling the truth, I would be throwing my own family into the abyss. I loved my son, but I also loved my daughter-in-law. I didn't want to destroy them, but I knew that the truth was the only thing that could free them. That's when I realized that, regardless of what happened, I could no longer be complicit in this lie. I could no longer hide behind a smile, behind a normality that no longer existed. What I feared most, what paralyzed me the most, was my son's reaction, and that was what kept me silent for longer. I didn't want to see my son lose hope, lose faith in what he believed to be the truth. I wanted to protect him from something that could destroy his life forever. I saw myself then, torn between the love I felt for my son and the need to free him from this pain, and at the same time, the weight of a betrayal that I couldn't just let go. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, but the decision was made. I knew that sooner or later, the truth would come out, and I would have to find the courage to face the consequences of everything that was happening. I don't know if there's a greater pain than the silence imposed by fear itself. That's how I felt back then. Silenced, trapped in my own suffering. Silence wasn't just the absence of words, but the presence of a truth I didn't know how to face. It wasn't just the lie that was eating me up, but the impossibility of acting, shouting, or finding a solution to something that, until then, seemed irreparable. The silence inside the house began to spread like a disease. The conversation between Joaquim and I became scarce, almost non-existent. We would look at each other, but there was no longer that comfort, that complicity. He closed himself off even more, and so did I. When he came home from work, there was no longer that tight embrace, nor the kind words that used to warm me. All that remained was a tired glance, as if we both knew that something irreversible had happened, but neither of us had the courage to name it. I tried to hide how much that situation was destroying me. I tried to smile at my son, make lunch, take care of the house as if the world were still the same. But the truth is that each gesture, each word, felt heavier than I could bear. I felt the weight of loneliness fall over me, but I couldn't let anyone know. The fear of exploding, of revealing everything, paralyzed me. I couldn't let my son know the truth. I couldn't let him see the pain on my face. What hurt me most was the fact that, while I held that silence, he continued believing in a lie. But inside, I was dying slowly. Each day that passed was harder. I saw myself alone in the middle of that house full of people. Estella, my daughter-in-law, was there every day, and she seemed even more distant, colder, more indifferent. With each gesture of hers, with each look she exchanged with Joachim, I felt an even greater pain. I didn't know how to deal with her presence, how to live with someone who, one day I had welcomed with such love, and who now looked at me as if nothing had happened. I became a stranger in my own house, and each passing day, silence consumed me even more. I spent sleepless nights, tossing and turning in bed, thinking about what to do, how to deal with it all. There were no more words that could ease what was happening inside me. When I finally fell asleep, it was an agitated sleep, marked by nightmares and waking up startled, as if the pain was bigger than I could endure. The more time went on, the more powerless I felt. I was losing myself, losing control over my own life. But at the same time, something inside me told me I couldn't let myself be destroyed. I felt that there was a strength dormant within me, something that, no matter how much I tried to ignore, was still there. But what to do with this strength? How to find a way out of something so big and painful? I didn't know. But silence, that cursed silence, was all I had left. Amid that whirlwind of feelings and insecurities, I found myself having to close myself off from the world. I started avoiding people, distancing myself from everything and everyone. The visits, the conversations, even the small joys of daily life seemed distant and meaningless. I isolated myself. The fear of facing the truth, the fear of what it all would lead to, made me build a fortress around myself. Inside, I knew I was at a dead end, but still, I couldn't do anything to change it. The pain of being surrounded by people who, in some way, had disappointed me was the worst of it all. I wanted to find a way to restore trust, to heal the wounds, but I was alone in this process. I couldn't speak. I couldn't reveal what I knew. I couldn't confront anyone. The weight of silence was crushing, but I thought there was no alternative. It was then that, on one of those days of profound silence, when I no longer knew whether I was alive or if I had already died inside, I began to realize that silence, despite everything, was giving me something. It was giving me the chance to reflect, to understand what really mattered. As painful as it was, silence made me see that, despite everything, my life hadn't ended. I still had something to do, I still had a story to write, even though, at that moment, it was filled with pain and uncertainties. And it was like this, between tears and fears, that I began to realize that silence was also a kind of resistance. Not resistance against the pain, but against destruction. I was still there, even if invisible, even if forgotten by myself. Silence didn't defeat me, but it strengthened me in ways I never imagined. It gave me the time I needed to gather the pieces of myself and begin thinking about what to do, even though I didn't know what the next step would be. The silence that dominated my home was no longer just a choice, but a prison I had built myself, but that, with each passing day, consumed me more. The fear of losing everything, the fear of destroying my family with the truth, kept me silent. But at some point, I knew I couldn't go on like this. The truth was right there, in front of me, more real than anything else. And I knew that, sooner or later, I would have to make a choice. The pain of seeing my son deceived, believing the lie Estella and Joachim had created, was what tormented me the most. He was happy, waiting for the child he thought was his, and I didn't know how to reveal the truth without breaking him. What hurt me most was knowing that I was, in some way, colluding in that lie, remaining silent. But the fear of losing my son, of watching the world collapse around him, made me hesitate. I wanted to protect him, but at the same time, I knew I could no longer hide the truth. There were days when I woke up with the weight of the decision crushing me. With every glance I exchanged with my son, I felt a knot in my chest. I could no longer pretend that nothing was wrong. I saw the looks exchanged between Estella and Joaquim, the complicity between them, and I felt like I was watching everything from the outside, like a spectator of my own suffering. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to them and confront them, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, watching. Shame consumed me, and at the same time, a growing anger mixed with the pain. The shame of being deceived, of being made a fool of not seeing what was right in front of my eyes. Hours passed, and once again I found myself alone, not knowing what to do with the truth that was now out in the open. There were no more doubts, no more room for explanations. The certainty of the betrayal suffocated me, and I knew that, in that moment, my life would never be the same. Everything I had built, all the dreams and the trust I had in the people I loved most, was falling apart. I sat there, on the porch, watching the sunset, wondering what to do next. What would I do with the pain that now filled me? What would I do with the truth that tore me apart inside? I didn't know yet, but one thing was clear. I could no longer live in the lie. I needed to face what was happening, no matter how difficult it would be. When the day came to an end and the house was silent, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep ignoring the obvious. What would happen next was beyond my control, but the only thing I could control was how I would react. And although I knew the pain would be great, I also knew that the truth had its own power. The truth, though painful, was my ally, and somehow it would give me the strength to move forward. I didn't know how or when, but I knew the moment had come. The weight of the truth was unbearable, and I couldn't carry it alone anymore. The silence that suffocated me, that kept me from acting, was about to break. What I feared more than anything was my son's reaction. How would he react when he learned that the woman he shared his dreams and future with had betrayed his trust? And what would I do with Joaquim's look? How could I face him after everything he had done? I decided that I needed to speak. I could no longer live with the fear of facing what I knew, with the anguish of not being able to help my son understand the truth. He deserved to know, and I, as a mother, could not allow him to be deceived any longer. But what hurt me the most was that, by revealing the truth, I would be destroying everyone's life. It wasn't just my pain that was at stake, but the fate of each of them. The house, which had always been our refuge, would be invaded by chaos that I didn't know how to control. The day finally came, and the opportunity to speak arose in a moment as simple as any other. We were all sitting at the table at the end of the afternoon, as we always did, in silence, eating what I had prepared with so much love. But that silence was no longer the same. There was something tense in the air, a tension that I could hardly bear. Joaquim's look was distant, as always, and Estella, for her part, avoided looking at me directly, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred her food. I knew she knew that the time to face the truth had come. I looked at my son, who smiled with that innocent joy that only children have. He was so happy, so secure in his belief, and it was then, in that moment, that the weight of my decision fell on me like an avalanche. I could no longer live with it. I could not continue to let him live in a lie. It was time to speak. It was time to set him free. With immense effort, I placed the cutlery on the table and looked at each of them. I was trembling inside, but I knew there was no turning back. My heart beat fast, but my mind was determined. I needed to be strong. I needed to be honest, no matter how difficult it was. Son, Estela, Joaquim. My voice faltered, but I managed to continue. I need you all to listen to what I have to say. My son looked at us, surprised, and then Joaquim and Estella also looked at me, their expressions shifting from surprise to apprehension that couldn't be disguised. What I knew, what they knew, and what was left of the lies between us was about to be exposed. I know everything, I said, and the words came out uncontrollably, as if my heart had spoken before my mind. I know what happened between you two, Joaquim, Estella. It was as if time had stopped. My son looked at us, trying to understand, his eyes filled with confusion. Estella swallowed hard, trying to hide the shame, while Joaquim seemed more shaken than I had imagined. He tried to speak, but his words got stuck in his throat. "You don't understand what you're saying, Mother," he tried to protest, but the truth was already out, and I wouldn't let them silence me anymore. "No, Joaquim, you don't understand. You betrayed me. You and Estella." I took a deep breath. I can't live with this anymore. I can't keep watching my son believing something that isn't true. I looked at my son, and the pain I saw in his eyes broke me in half. He stood up from the table, his hands trembling. "No, Mom, this can't be true. Estella, you deceived me." He looked at her, and I saw the hope fade from his gaze. Estella couldn't hold his gaze. She lowered her head, and tears began to fall from her face. "I never wanted this to happen," Estella whispered, her voice full of regret. "I love you, Joachim, but things took a turn I couldn't control." But my son could no longer hear her. He turned away, wordlessly, and ran to his room. The sound of his footsteps, each heavier than the last, seemed to weigh on all of us. Estella started crying, and Joachim, in silence, stood there with his head lowered, not knowing what to say. The shock was visible on all our faces, but the truth was there, exposed, and now there was no turning back. I knew that this moment would change our lives forever. What I had done, what I had said, couldn't be undone. The weight of the choice I had made now fell on all of us. But looking ahead, I knew that at least my son now knew the truth. From that moment on, he could make his own choices. But above all, I knew that the truth had the power to heal, no matter how painful it was. The silence that once consumed me had now dissipated, and as difficult as it was, that moment of confrontation was the first step toward healing. The weight of the truth had been revealed, and now, everything I feared began to take shape before my eyes. It was clear that what would happen next would mark everyone involved for the rest of our lives. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment when my son learned the truth. I knew he would feel the pain of being deceived, but no one told me that the pain could be so deep, so devastating. That afternoon seemed as ordinary as any other. The sun was shining outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind, and I, as always, was at home taking care of things. But that tranquility was soon shattered. My son, who had isolated himself in his room since the revelation, finally decided to come into the living room. He seemed so lost, so different from the man he had always been. I looked at him, and the longing for the son I once knew tightened my heart. He sat at the table, without looking at anyone, his shoulders slumped, his eyes red. Estella was there too, sitting, trying to stay composed, but I saw the shame in her gaze. Joachim had not yet arrived, and for a moment I thought it might be better to wait. But I knew the truth could no longer wait, and my son, with that expression of pain, made me realize that there was no more delaying. With a trembling voice he spoke. "Mom, I need to know. I need to understand." He looked at me with a silent plea, a plea for answers. I knew he still didn't fully believe what he had heard, and that the shock of seeing his world collapse was about to hit him fully. The weight of everything was about to crush him, and I, as his mother, felt powerless. How could I soften his pain? How could I explain to him something that I myself could hardly comprehend? It was Estella who spoke first, her voice broken, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Joachim. I love you, but the child I'm carrying is not yours. I lied to you." Her words fell like a bomb, and the room seemed to shrink. My son was silent, and I saw the shock take over him. He closed his eyes, as if trying to push away what he was hearing. He couldn't believe it. The pain of realizing that his wife, the woman he had planned a future with, had been capable of hiding such a great lie, was devastating. Slowly he stood up from the table and walked over to the window. He looked outside, but saw nothing but his own pain. The tears began to flow down his face, and I saw how he struggled to process it all. He, who had always been so strong, so determined, was now lost in a storm of emotions. He turned back to us, the expression of shock still on his face, and asked, "So who is the father? How did this happen, Estella? How could you do this to me? How could you deceive me this way?" His words were filled with anger and disillusionment. He didn't want to believe what was being said, but the truth was there, naked and raw. Estella couldn't answer right away. She just kept apologizing, over and over again, unable to say anything more. Joachim, with his eyes full of pain, stood there in silence, head down, not knowing what to say. The shock was visible on all our faces, but the truth was there, exposed, and now there was no turning back. I saw my son devastated, and the pain of seeing him like that was more painful than any betrayal I could have experienced. As a mother, my instinct was to run to him, to hug him, but I knew that in that moment, the only comfort he sought was to find some explanation, and I had none. The only thing I could do was be there for him, and even if it was in silence, accompany him in his suffering. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Joachim couldn't speak. He stayed in the living room, but he seemed to be somewhere else, in a world where the pain made no sense. Estella, equally devastated, didn't know what else to say. She wanted to apologize, but she knew words were not enough to erase the lie she had built. My son, on the other hand, withdrew to his room and stayed there alone, trying to understand what had happened. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to look at Estella anymore. I knew he was trying to find some meaning in it all, but in that moment, there was no way to make sense of it. As evening fell, the house that once was a home full of laughter and joy was now filled with a deep and agonizing pain. The silence inside the house was overwhelming, and I found myself once again lost in my own helplessness. What could I do to ease my son's pain? What could I do to heal the wound that Estella and Joachim had opened? The questions had no answers, and I saw myself in the deepest solitude, trying to understand what would happen to our family, to our future. I knew my son would never be the same, and, in a way, I also knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The truth, as liberating as it was, also brought with it the weight of destruction, and the pain my son felt would be a long road to travel. The day he discovered that he wasn't the father of that child was the day that changed everything. He was no longer the man who believed his life had been built on truth and love. He was now a man marked by a lie he never imagined would be his reality. I felt as if I had been torn from my own ground. The life that once seemed so solid now disintegrated like sand slipping through my fingers. How could I start over? How could I piece together a broken heart, a soul torn apart by pain and disillusionment? What was left for me after everything that had happened? The truth, as liberating as it was, also left me directionless. I was lost, but something inside me, something very deep, knew I still had to move forward. The days that followed my son's discovery were the hardest of my life. The house, once full of the sounds of laughter and conversation, was now filled with a heavy silence. Sadness hung over everything, and I, as a mother, didn't know how to comfort my son. He was unrecognizable, and his pain mirrored in my own soul. I looked at him and knew he was broken, and I wondered, how could he rebuild himself? How could I help him out of this darkness? At that time, I felt that the weight of responsibility upon me was immense. He was still my son, and I still had to be his mother, even if that meant facing him, helping him heal his wounds, even though I had my own. I knew my role was to support him, to give him the strength he needed to move forward. But as much as I wanted to help him, the truth was, I needed help too. I was lost, just as he was. I withdrew from everyone. There was no longer room for laughter, nor for the routine I so loved. The things that once brought me pleasure now had no meaning. I walked through the house like a shadow, as if I was no longer part of the life I had once lived with so much love. I saw my son drift further away, immersed in his pain, and Estella, in her shame, also distanced herself. Joachim, with a distant look, avoided me, and I no longer knew how to approach them. What was left of our family was disintegrating before my eyes, and I wondered if it would ever be possible to put it back together. It was on a cold winter morning that upon waking, I realized I needed to find strength. The silence suffocated me, but I knew I couldn't continue like this. I couldn't let pain swallow me whole. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a woman I barely recognized. My hair lacked its shine. My eyes were red from endless tears. But when I looked more closely, I realized I was still there. I was still alive, and that was enough to begin again. I started with small steps. The first thing I did was force myself to get out of bed. It was the hardest decision of all, because every move I made felt like carrying the weight of an entire life. But I knew if I didn't make that choice, I would be trapped forever in that sadness. I went to the window and opened the curtain. The day was clear, though the sky was cloudy. I breathed deeply, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. Perhaps it was the sensation of being alive that gave me some strength, but at that moment, something inside me stirred. I decided to take one step at a time. There was no hurry, and that was what scared me the most. The idea that I didn't know what the future held was terrifying, but at the same time, there was no going back. I had to start over, and to do that, I had to give myself permission to fail, to fall, to cry when needed, but also to rise. In the following days, I began to focus on the small things. I made coffee in the morning and ate my meals in silence. I started organizing the house, a simple task, but one that gave me a sense of control again. But most importantly, it was when I began to look inside myself. For years, I had put myself second, always putting the needs of others before mine. Now it was my turn. I needed to rebuild myself, and that could only happen if I allowed the pain to shape me, not consume me. Over time, I began to realize that my pain was not my enemy. It was the catalyst for something new, something I didn't fully understand yet, but I knew was within me. When I found the strength to smile again, even if it was weak, it was the first step towards healing. I realized that the restart wouldn't happen overnight, but I was moving, and that was enough. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that, as hard as it was, I was stronger than ever. I no longer depended on others' approval. I no longer saw myself as a victim of a story that was imposed on me. I was now the author of my own life, and that was a freedom I didn't know I had until that moment. When I looked at my son for the first time after that day, I saw something new in his gaze. The pain was still there, but there was also a spark, a desire to move forward, to find his own strength. I knew he was, little by little, rebuilding himself too. The restart wouldn't be easy for him, just as it hadn't been for me. But at last, we were beginning to rise. And it was in this small restart that I realized the future, despite being uncertain, was in our hands. And over time, all we needed was the courage to take the first step, no matter how difficult it was. Sometimes, life's deepest pains teach us lessons that happiness could never teach. I always believed happiness was the goal, that it came with time, with love, and with trust. But the truth is that happiness is something fleeting, something that can be lost suddenly. Pain, however, that's persistent. It finds us in the most unexpected moments, and although it may seem like our enemy, it has the power to transform us, to help us grow, to teach us what we never imagined we needed to learn. I looked at my son, who had been deeply hurt by the lie Estella and Joaquim had built around him. He was shattered, trying to piece together his life that had been crushed by a reality he never wanted to believe. But I also knew he was, little by little, learning to live with the pain, learning to cope with what had happened. He was becoming stronger, wiser, and I, as his mother, saw in him the same transformation that was happening inside me. Pain, no matter how bitter, taught me to value the small things. Before all of this happened, I didn't realize how fragile life could be, how the moments we share with those we love are precious and, at times, irreplaceable. I learned to give more value to the present, to what is right in front of us, to what we can still do. I learned that forgiveness isn't just for the other person, but also for ourselves. And it was this that began to heal the wound that the betrayal left. At first, anger took over me. I wanted to take revenge on Estella, on Joaquim, on everyone who had betrayed me. I wanted to scream, to make them feel the same pain I felt. But anger, just like pain, is also temporary. It comes with the intensity of a storm, but if we don't let it go, it begins to consume us. That's what I learned. Anger is not the cure, it's the prison. I decided to put aside the desire for revenge because I knew it would keep me stuck in the past. I wanted to be free. I wanted to live. Pain also taught me that we shouldn't carry the weight of what we cannot change. When I finally accepted that life would go on, no matter what happened, I began to realize that I had no control over the actions of others. I could only control my own reaction. And it was in that moment that I found a peace I never imagined I would have. It wasn't complete peace, as the wounds were still there, but it was a quiet peace, an acceptance of what was. I saw my son rebuilding himself, little by little. He still had a lot to learn, and I knew he hadn't finished his journey through pain, but he was no longer lost. He was starting to understand that life had taken him down a difficult path, but that he had the power to choose how he would move forward from there. He learned, in the hardest way possible, that we cannot control the actions of others, but we can choose how to react to them. For me, pain also became a lesson in forgiveness. Not the easy kind of forgiveness, the one we give just because we're pressured, but the true kind, the kind that comes from within, when we understand that the other person also carries their own battles, their own weaknesses. Estella had betrayed me, but she was also losing something valuable, the trust and love I once had for her. I knew that to move forward, I needed to forgive her, not because she deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I wanted to free myself from that pain, from that anger, and forgiveness was the key. I also learned to forgive myself. I wasn't responsible for the betrayal, but I felt as though I had failed in some way. I questioned whether I could have done something differently, whether I could have seen the signs earlier. But the truth is that no one is immune to pain. Pain doesn't choose who it will hit, and betrayal doesn't choose who it will hurt. The only thing we can control is how we deal with it. And it was in that lesson that I found the strength to start over. What I realized over time was that life isn't about avoiding pain, but about learning to live with it. It never completely disappears, but over time, it becomes a part of us, a part that teaches us to be stronger, wiser. I am no longer the woman I was before all of this happened, but the woman I have become is whole, more aware of her own strength. I looked at my house and my family, now broken, and I realized that I didn't need perfection anymore. Perfection doesn't exist, and true strength is in learning to live with imperfections. Estela, Joaquim, my son, all of us had scars, but those scars don't define us. They teach us, and above all, pain taught me the most important lesson, the ability to love, even after everything we've been through. Love is the only thing that keeps us alive, that lets us move forward. And even with all the wounds, love is still what matters most. If today I decided to tell all of this, it wasn't for anyone to feel sorry for me. I'm not a poor, pitiful woman. I am a woman who lived her story, with loves and heartbreaks, and who learned that no disappointment has the power to kill who we really are. I am no longer young, it's true, but I carry within me a wisdom that only time and hardships can give us. Throughout life, I learned that our falls don't define us, but rather, it's what we do with them. And my story, though marked by great suffering, has an ending I never imagined, but one that brought me the peace I have today. If there is a legacy I would like to leave, it's the understanding that we don't need to be perfect to be happy, nor be free from all pains to find our way. You, my son, who are the reason for my existence, were my greatest gift and my greatest lesson. When pain came, you showed me that my mission was to be stronger for myself and for you. Now, I see you grow and become a strong man, one who learned from his own falls, just as I did. What I want you to take from my story, my dear, is that pain is temporary, but the courage and resilience it teaches us are eternal. I would like to tell you, and all the women who listen to me, that we should never be ashamed of our failures. Life, no matter how hard it may seem, doesn't take us completely. The thing is, when pain arrives, it breaks us, but it also teaches us how to rebuild. Never accept less than you deserve. Never let a lie destroy what you've built with honesty. And above all, remember that no one ever has the power to take from you what is yours by right, your dignity. I may have been deceived, but I was never defeated. I may have been betrayed, but I didn't lose my ability to love, to trust, and to live. Because the true treasure we carry is not in people or circumstances, but in our ability to move forward no matter how much the storms shake us. I taught you the value of family, truth, work, and honesty. And when the lie tried to destroy everything I had built, it was precisely these values that kept me standing. I knew that the truth would come to light. I knew that pain, no matter how deep, would pass. What really matters is what we do with what life gives us. As painful as it was, what I had left was the ability to rebuild, to start over, to rise and move forward. I am no longer the woman I was before all of this happened, but that's not a defeat. It's proof that I am stronger now than I was before. And that is the legacy I want to leave for you, my son. For you, my dear, that never, ever let yourself be defined by the pains life brings. Every scar, every tear, every loss has the power to teach us how to be better, how to be whole. Life will not always be easy, my son. I know that better than anyone. But remember, pain is not the end. Pain is just a step, a stage. What truly matters is what we do with it. And in the end, what brings us down is also what strengthens us. You can look back and see the mistakes, the failures, the betrayals, but look forward and see the strength, the resilience, and the love you carry inside. What I want you to learn, more than anything else, is that love is the greatest power we have. Not the romantic love that deceives and hurts us, but the love for ourselves, for our truth, for our dignity. When you truly love yourself, no one else has the power to harm you. I, who have lived through so many disappointments, can guarantee you that the one thing that never fails is self-love. When you know and respect yourself, everything else becomes easier. I lived with the weight of betrayal, but I also learned to live with the freedom it brought me. The freedom to be who I am, to follow my own path, to make my own choices. And this, son, is what I leave you. The freedom to be yourself, with your mistakes and your successes, with your falls and victories, because in the end, that's what matters. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you, and until the next story.